Hi folks, I want to do a quick video for you on the brain and the different anatomical features of the brain, different regions of the brain, and their functions. We'll do kind of these first few learning outcomes here. We're really going to talk about the brain from the perspective of, well, it's sort of two perspectives. Going from the spinal cord anteriorly, we'll talk about those anatomical regions. It turns out that those correspond more or less to the evolution of the vertebrate brain as well. So we had the most posterior structures of the brain evolving first and the most anterior structures evolving later. But then that also correlates with the types of functions that they're responsible for, with some of the oldest, most critical, I don't want to say primitive exactly, but critical body functions like reflexes and homeostatic regulatory mechanisms, which don't rely on a lot of complex processing. Those are the most posterior, and then we get to the more anterior. That's where we have lots of complex processing going on. That's where behaviors originate, drives to do certain things, planning, all of that in the more anterior portions of the brain. So those two perspectives kind of underlie this reasoning of going from posterior to anterior. Okay, so we have our central nervous system being our brain and spinal cord. Remember that from before. So we're going to do the major structures. We are going to talk about the cranial nerves that we find in the brain, and the cranial nerves. Just like we have in each section of the spinal cord, we have spinal nerves emanating from and going toward it. We have the same thing in the brain. In each section of the brain, we have a number of cranial nerves, and that's largely a reflection of the fact that the brain is just a kind of fancied up version of the spinal cord. It's the anterior spinal cord made larger and more complex, and that's so the underlying structures are really the same. Right? And we'll say a little bit about the meninges, the protective layers that cover the brain. Okay, so first I want to remind us of the anatomical divisions of the central nervous system, that being the brain, whoops, my pointer, that being the brain here, and then the spinal cord here. Those are the anatomical divisions of the central nervous system. But we also can talk about the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. And these are largely, they're both functional and they're anatomical divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So we can talk about of course, the somatic, right? The voluntary, and we ran into that when we looked at the spinal cord, right? So the somatic nervous system is all of the sensory data that we're conscious of, or the sensory input that we're conscious of, the conscious decisions to move particular muscles, and the actual movement of those muscles. That's voluntary. And then there's the autonomic, or also called the visceral, right? Or the involuntary. That's all the things that we're not really conscious of the processing of that particular sensory input, nor are we conscious necessarily of that output, right? Sometimes we are, but we're certainly not in control of it, right? And so just an example, the somatic nervous system, right? We have the motor neurons originating in this anterior portion of the brain, the conscious portion of the brain. So we consciously decide, for example, to move our finger or to blink our eyes. Blinking may not be the best example because we do that also unconsciously, but sneering, right? We decide to do all of those things. So the motor neurons are all originating in this conscious part of our brain, the part that's involved with planning. And those motor neurons then synapse in the case where we're actually controlling parts of the face or the eyes, right? Like looking one way or another, those motor neurons will synapse with other lower motor neurons, right? In the spine, in the brain, and those go off to skeletal muscle, or they'll synapse with motor neurons down in the spinal cord, which we know go off to skeletal muscle. That's the somatic. Then the autonomic or the visceral, those motor neurons have their origins in an older region of the brain, and a region that we're not quite conscious of. That's the thalamus and hypothalamus, right? These are both part of this portion here, the thing you think of as gray matter with all these striations in it, right? All of this anterior portion and this smaller portion, which is actually kind of at the center of this big anterior portion, is all part of the diencephalon. But this is responsible for the processing and decision making for the autonomic nervous system, right? The unconscious or involuntary nervous system. So these motor neurons have their cell bodies here in the thalamus and hypothalamus, and then they typically have actually three motor neurons, a first order, second order, and then third order motor neuron. And again, these can, synapse in this sort of slightly lower portion of the brain stem where we have a lot of autonomic nuclei, and then those go off to affect smooth muscle, glands, heart muscle, fat cells, or they can go down to the spinal cord, right, and connect with motor neurons in the ventral region of the spinal cord and go off to those same visceral effectors. So we can think of these two different divisions of the nervous system, both anatomical in terms of where is the origin of their motor neurons and how many motor neurons are in that pathway, as well as functional in terms of are they controlling voluntary movements, or are they controlling involuntary things like contraction of smooth muscle and making the hairs on your arms stand up, or contraction of smooth muscle and moving food down your digestive tube, right? The smooth muscle surrounding your digestive tube, or the secretion of saliva from salivary glands, or sweat from sweat glands, or the acceleration in heart rate, right? So those are all involuntary. Okay, this is a brain that is blown up a bit. Now you can see in here is a brain a brain stem, and it's surrounded largely by this anterior portion here. So this anterior portion, we'll go, so we're going posterior, right? We have our spinal cord, and then above that we have the medulla oblongata, right? So this swelling right here, this swollen region right here. The medulla oblongata is largely responsible still for relaying sensory information. So the spinal cord, a lot of that white matter is just axons moving up and down the spinal cord. And the same is more or less true of the medulla oblongata. There's just more information coming in and synapsing here in the thalamus and then being directed elsewhere. So lots of incoming sensory information. There are some in this very far back portion of the brain, there are some autonomic nuclei. Remember, nuclei are just clusters of interacting cells that are sharing information and often doing some processing and making decisions. So these are autonomic nuclei back here. We'll see these are responsible for all kinds of functions that are just taken care of on their own, like breathing and swallowing and vomiting and sneezing and all sorts of things like that. So very old, very sort of primitive portion of the brain, lots of reflexive and regulatory nuclei that we're not really conscious of. So this is all mostly visceral nuclei, autonomic nuclei back here. And then anterior to that, the pons, more relaying of sensory input to the thalamus and also to this portion of the brain back here, the cerebellum, which we'll see is important for balance regulation. And then there's some more visceral nuclei here, and there's also a few somatic motor centers here, but they're involved in somatic reflexes that are kind of like spinal reflexes in the sense that they don't really require a lot of input to be initiated, and the response is more or less always the same. So again, lots of reflex nuclei and regulatory nuclei. This is the cerebellum back here, coordinating complex motor patterns. So when you learn how to ride a bike, when you learn how to climb, when you learn how to walk, the cerebellum is important for helping to structure the motor programs that end up being stored anteriorly here, but are constantly modified and updated via input from the cerebellum and sensory input to the cerebellum. So we'll talk about that more. And then we have our midbrain, our mesencephalon. This is doing now more, a little bit more higher level processing. This is processing a lot of visual and auditory data. Not all, and vision and hearing is not something that all vertebrates have. So this is a little bit more advanced. And then after that processing of that incoming data, there are some reflex nuclei in there that are using that data and responsible for a variety of different reflexes associated with our eyes and with our ears. So a little bit more advanced processing here, and some nuclei that are involved with consciousness and decision making, and simple decision making like start moving and stop moving, right? Okay, and then we get into our forebrain, our diencephalon, which has our thalamus and hypothalamus. Again, these are doing a lot sort of higher level processing. There's editing of information going on here. There's projecting it to different regions of the brain. There's also lots of processing of visceral or autonomic input, sensory input, and then some control centers for what to do with that input. Now, these are not reflexive, right? This isn't simple reflex arc type of things like we had going on in the medulla oblongata and pons. This is more, I'm taking a variety of inputs and making some decision about what to do about it. Although that is an involuntary decision, it's not one that you're making consciously. And then we have the last part of the forebrain is the cerebrum. This huge expanded piece right here is the cerebrum. Here's where all of our conscious thought is happening. Here's where all of our perceptions of conscious stimuli is happening, and this is all stimuli that we're conscious of. So when you feel cold, when you feel pressure on your fingers, when you decide to do something about that, all that is being sensed here in the cerebrum, and decisions are being made about what to do about that up here in the cerebrum. So this is the much more complex processing center, and it's where all the somatic nervous system is sending its sensory information, and also where all the motor output is being initiated is here. Okay, so let's talk about these more in depth. And just a reminder of the development of the brain. I kind of referenced this before, but we have, when we're really developing very early on, here we are at 1 month, we just have these 3 recognizable regions, the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. You can see their relative sizes. Now, this is not, if you were to look at the brain of an adult shark or a jawless fish, or even many fairly basal fishes, their adult brains don't look very much different than this in terms of the size of each of these regions. But as we get more complex, and vertebrates got more complex, and so especially humans, these regions really changed in size. And you can see how they're starting to change here, with this occupying a little less space, a little bit more space here, and quite a bit more here. And then by the time we're adults, you can see this telencephalon has grown enormous and folded back over the top of the brain. This diencephalon, or the thalamus and hypothalamus, is really quite a bit smaller here. And then we do have a pretty big cerebellum. Remember, this is important for balance intensive activities. And then remaining relatively small are our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. And so from the hindbrain comes the pons and cerebellum and medulla oblongata. From the midbrain comes the midbrain, and it doesn't really change. And then from the forebrain, we get these 2 seats of a lot of processing. The diencephalon here are hypothalamus and thalamus, and that's the seat of processing of a lot of sensory input that we're not conscious of, and that we're not really in control of the motor output of it. And then the cerebellum, this is all somatic input, so sensory input that we are conscious of and that we do consciously, and we decide on some motor output. That's all here in the cerebellum, the telencephalon. Okay, all right. So that's a little bit of history of it. Just to remind you of our spinal cord and the central canal of the spinal cord, right? It's lined with ependymal cells that are ciliated and circulating cerebrospinal fluid. Well, that actually goes right up into the brain, given that the brain is just an anterior extension and elaboration of the spinal cord. And so here, this central canal actually gets quite large, and we get these paired chambers called ventricles. And it's here that we have special ependymal cells that actually produce and secrete the cerebrospinal fluid, as well as move it along with cilia, right? And so these chambers are quite enlarged in the brain. Okay, so let's do a quick bit on meninges before we look at each of these individual brain regions more intensely. The meninges are connective tissue layers. They're there to support the brain. They're there to protect the brain. And they've got these three layers. There's a sort of hollow space inside of each one of these. So there's the dura mater, and there's two layers to this dura mater. There's this outer and inner layer. This is actually kind of welded to the cranium, to the skull bones. And then here we have the another layer of the dura mater. Here is this dural sinus through which we have circulating through which we have circulating cerebrospinal fluid. We also have then cerebrospinal fluid down here. So below this dura mater, we have a small little subdural space, and then the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater, probably named because of the web-like structures of connective tissue here. There is called the arachnoid trabeculae. So arachnoid, like arachnid, so web-like. And we've also got cerebrospinal fluid in here, and then we have pia mater down here, which is actually shrink wrap to the skull, more or less. That's kind of what it looks like. Is plastic wrap or cling wrap that's just been suctioned to the skull. So we won't worry about these too much, except to say that collectively they're there for these functions of protecting the brain and supporting the brain cells. So cerebrospinal fluid circulates in through the subarachnoid space and out here into the dural sinus, and then back around again. And so we get this constant circulation of cerebrospinal fluid kind of up and then out here and then back down and up through the central canal. And so we get that cerebrospinal fluid has waste in it for sure, but it's also got oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's got amino acids that brain cells need. It's got nutrients that brain cells need. So it's functioning very much like the bloodstream in providing nutrients to brain cells. So the cerebrospinal fluid is supportive in that way, that it's supplying all the nervous system cells with the right concentration of amino acids and sugars and all that sort of thing. Okay, and then protective in the sense that this is fluid. So what it basically produces is kind of an airbag for the brain to protect it against sharp impacts, right? If you think about taking an egg, imagine an egg is your brain, and let's say you have a little tub, an empty tub, right? If you drop that egg into that tub, it's going to explode all over, right? But if instead you fill that tub with water and you drop the egg in, it's going to be cushioned, and it's in by that water, and it's probably not going to break. It may tap the bottom of the jug, but it may not. And if it does tap it, it's not going to be very hard because that water has basically provided a bit of cushion for it. And that's also what this cerebrospinal fluid can do, is to cushion the brain down here from smashing into the skull bones and exploding all over the inside of our skull, right? So it's got that important protective function. And so here you can see a little bit more closely the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, where it's coming out here, right, and circulating around underneath this. It's circulating up into this subdural space, and then out this sinus, into this subarachnoid space, and then out this sinus and into the subdural space and back again. So you can just see it circulating around here and then out into this dural space. Now that is secreted or produced in a couple of places here, right? That cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the choroid plexus, in the ventricles, right? And then those ependymal cells that line the central canal, as well as these ventricles, help to circulate it all around. Okay, let's look at the major features of the brain. We have our hindbrain here, which consists of, yeah, the hindbrain, we have the medulla oblongata, pons, and cerebellum. Right? That's all from the hindbrain. We call this entire thing the brain stem, but that also includes the midbrain, which really comes from the mesencephalon. Right? And then we have our diencephalon here. Look how small this really is. Our diencephalon, our thalamus and hypothalamus. Then here's a ventricle. Here's actually a bunch of white matter that represents the crossing of axons from one hemisphere of the brain to another, so from right to left. So you're seeing a bunch of axon there. And then all of this, whoa, that's all telencephalon, right? That's all forebrain, right? And in adults, this is then, well, in advanced embryos, this is called the cerebrum, right? This is all of our conscious thought and processing up here. Okay. So let's again go here with the brain stem, the lower portion of the brain stem. And that's consisting of cranial, most of the cranial nerves, right? And we'll get to know these cranial nerves a bit, 3 through 12. The medulla oblongata, the pons, and then our mesencephalon up here, and our mesencephalon, and then anterior to that is our diencephalon, right? Our diencephalon. But really, brainstem is just this stuff here: the medulla oblongata, pons, and mesencephalon, right? And of course, collected within that. The cerebellums, we don't really call that part of the brain stem, but it is from the hindbrain. So it is from the same embryonic source as these medulla oblongata and the pons is. Let's look at these cranial nerves. Front to back is easiest. And if you think about this in terms of, well, we'll just go front to back, right? And we'll look at these cranial nerves. Now, you saw in this previous, no, not very well. This is looking at the underside of the spinal cord and the brainstem. So if you were to sort of tip my head up, you're looking basically at, and then take all this out, right? You'd be looking at this under here. I'll see if we can see this on the zygote body. Actually, it might come through okay there. This is what you'd be seeing. This is ventral, so this is underneath, right? If you take all this out, here's what you'd be seeing. Most anteriorly, we have, and we don't see it here, but we have the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is actually, or it's also called the olfactory bulb. It's a pretty short nerve, and it goes to the olfactory epithelium, or really runs from the olfactory epithelium back to the brain. So cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory. It's a pure sensory nerve, right? So as we talk about these, we're going to think about whether they're pure sensory or motor or a mix of sensory and motor. Then behind that, we have the optic nerve. Here you can see the optic nerve. It actually crosses. So the optic nerve is carrying sensory information from the retina of your eye back to your midbrain and then to your cerebrum for more advanced processing. So the optic nerve is a purely sensory nerve, purely carrying sensory information. Now the next ones are also associated with the eyes. The oculomotor is responsible for pupil diameter. So it changes the contraction and relaxation of the muscles of your iris, which surround your pupil. And that really is what controls pupil diameter. It's not doing anything to the pupil because the pupil is just a hollow, it's an empty space, right? When you're looking in the black of someone's pupil or your own pupil, you're actually looking in the back of their eye. So the oculomotor is controlling the iris muscles. So my iris is blue, you can see that, but the dark in the middle is the pupil, and by contracting the iris muscles, it can make the pupil either larger or smaller. There are 2 sets of muscles in the iris. So that's a pure motor nerve. The trochlear also controls your eye, but it controls movement of the entire eyeball rather than controlling the how much light is getting in, which is what the oculomotor does. This is also a pure motor nerve, and the trochlear nerve controls movement of the eye toward movement of this eye, for example, toward the center. So if I go cross-eyed, really using my trochlear nerves. The trigeminal is a mixed nerve. It's a sensory and a motor nerve. The trigeminal is here. Unfortunately, you don't see it branching. It has trigeminal means three origins, so it really quickly branches as soon as it emerges. It basically goes to the face and to the mouth and is responsible for some motor control as well as sensory control. The abducens, abduct, right? Abduct, you've seen this before. So the abducens is another motor nerve, pure motor nerve associated with the eye, and it's causing my right eye to abduct, to look out to the side. Now my left eye is abducting, right, out to the side. The facial nerve, another mixed nerve, kind of like the trigeminal, but this is really just serving the facial region, so much more superficial even than the trigeminal is, both sensory and motor. The auditory or vestibulocochlear, a pure sensory nerve. This is one that we'll see is in our responsible for a few different things. Certainly our perception of hearing, but also our sense of balance, where we are in space, whether we're face up or face down, how fast we're moving, and in what direction we're moving. So a bunch of stuff that the vestibulocochlear does. The glossopharyngeal, another mixed nerve. This tells you what regions it's serving. Glosso means tongue, pharyngeal means the throat. So this is connected to taste buds. It's also connected to the muscles of the tongue. So glossopharyngeal is a mixed nerve, as is the vagus nerve, which is a kind of a weird one. This vagus is from the word vagrant, right? It's also called the wandering nerve, which is what a vagrant is a wanderer, right? So the vagus nerve is a mixed nerve that really goes everywhere in your body, and we'll see how important that is for controlling different regions of your peripheral nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic regions of your nervous system. And then we have our spinal accessory and our hypoglossal nerve. Spinal accessory, we don't have much to say about. Hypoglossal nerve is below the tongue, so it's doing a little bit, it's a pure motor nerve, but really is associated with mostly moving the tongue. Spinal accessory is also a pure motor nerve, right? So we'll see that the ones that will meet later, the ones that are involved with the special senses, although you can probably pick all those out that I've talked about so far, both sensory and a couple motor devoted to special senses. Okay. So we've talked about our brain stem. We're kind of leaving off the diencephalon for now. We'll get to that in the next video. We're really talking about our mesencephalon, pons, and medulla oblongata, right? And from back to front, right? It's this direction. So let's jump into these a little bit more. These are, remember, largely reflexive centers back here, some regulatory centers. The more anterior we get, we have more regulatory centers. It begins basically reflexive and becomes more regulatory or complex reflexes when we get up to the mesencephalon. So here's our medulla oblongata, lots of autonomic processing. So cardiac, heart rate. Vasomotor, that's how contracted or relaxed are your blood vessels, right? And serving which parts of your body, right? So this is important for shunting blood to one place in your body or another. Respiratory rate, how fast are you breathing? Respiratory depth, how deep is that breathing? Coughing, clearing something from your airway. Sneezing, clearing something from the other airway. Vomiting, clearing something that you shouldn't have eaten. Swallowing, balance, just sort of a general coordination of your body, and digestion, so secretion of digestive enzymes, things like that. So lots of reflexes here, right? Lots of reflexes that you're just not in control of, lots of motor output that you're not in control of. And I say reflexes, but also regulatory centers here, right? You're not able to do all the thought processing and conscious stuff that you're doing, partly because you're able to do that, partly because another region of your brain, right, a very basic region of your brain, is taking care of all this other stuff, right? So you don't have to think about, oh, it's time to swallow, it's time for my heart to beat, it's time to make my heart beat, it's time to contract this set of blood vessels to make more blood go to this other area of my body. It's time to breathe. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff, right? And so that's because you have these other regions of the body taking care of these functions that are so critical to life, right? If any of these things go wrong, right, your airway gets clogged, you eat something that's been dead for way too long and is gross, or you stop breathing, you die, right? So we have to have other parts of our brain take care of that for us. We do have sensory and motor nuclei here. So actually cranial nerves 8 through 12 are in this region of the brain. So our sense of our perception of hearing, our perception of equilibrium, perception of taste, but then all the motor activity associated with digestion, right? Swallowing, vomiting, that's all here in these regulatory nuclei here. And then of course, relaying information to and from the conscious parts of our brain. The pons, we have more cranial nuclei here. So cranial nerves originate and propagate information to this area, the pons. So in terms of sensory information, we get information about sounds, which was really a perception, but pressure waves out there in the environment, as well as which way we're moving and how fast we're moving. All that sensory information comes to the pons first so that it can be processed, and there are appropriate reflexes associated with that. And then there's also motor output that goes along with that. So eye movement, chewing, production of saliva, that's all motor output that has origins here in the pons, this very old center of the brain. So chewing and salivation is one of those things that we don't really think about secreting saliva and digestive enzymes, but your pons does that for you. There are regulatory nuclei that do that. There's also a major accessory regulatory nucleus for respiration, so it modifies the respiratory output that's produced by the medulla oblongata. So there's a complex relationship between those nuclei here in the pons and the respiratory nuclei in the medulla oblongata. There's also a bit of a little relay center. So there's some nuclei here that are getting a bit of information before sharing it back to the cerebellum. And then, of course, we have ascending and descending nerves that are traveling through shouldn't say nerves, tracts of neurons that are traveling along the spinal cord, right? Then we have our midbrain up here. Our midbrain, we have some more nuclei that are now responsible for some more advanced processing and of visual input and auditory input. So reflexes associated with how much light is coming into the eye, where the eye is trying to focus, actually focusing on something that flashes across the visual field. That's all taken care of by nuclei that's here in this region, and the cranial nerves 3 and 4 have their motor output, originate their motor output here, right? It's also an integration station for visual and auditory input. And this is largely reflexive. So we have visual input coming in and synapsing here first. So coming in through the optic nerve to this area first, and that helps us to then change our lens and pupil diameter. And there's also motor output here for somatic nuclei or somatic motor output, controlling muscles of the head and neck. So when we get some sort of auditory input, like someone snaps their finger to one side of your head or the other, we might turn that way, and that's a reflexive activity. So it's somatic, it's a somatic reflex in that it involves skeletal muscle cells, right? So that's where that motor information is generated, is here in the midbrain. And then there's the subconscious regulation of your body position, your balance. You don't think about these things, but you automatically do it, including muscle tone in particular muscle groups that are activated or not active, or even those that just require a little bit of muscle tone all the time, like a lot of the sphincter muscles that guard the exits to your body. You have a lot of motor output for those sorts of subconscious corrections, small corrections you have to make to body, to posture of skeletal muscles. That has nuclei here, and that motor output can originate there. All right, and then we have the diencephalon. That's for our next next lecture. So we covered a lot here. I want you to definitely go through this information and distill it, and if you can, put it in your own words, so that you really know whether or not you understand what all is going on in these different areas. And do think about the differences between reflexes, which are really simple. Just take a little input and then that generates a predictable output, versus regulation, or regulation of regulatory motor output, which is really getting lots of different pieces of information and then deciding on appropriate output, right? So most of the regulatory nuclei, any of the regulatory nuclei we talked about, are all autonomic, right? Of course, a lot of the reflexive nuclei or areas in the brain are also autonomic. There are just a couple of regulatory reflexive areas that also involve somatic output, so that involve control of skeletal muscle cells. Also, just take a quick look back through at all of these cranial nerves, right? We're going to see these again in the future, but we need to know which special sense they're associated with and whether they're sensory or they're motor or they're mixed. And then functions of the different meningeal layers, knowing what the meningeal layers are, and then also just sort of their collective function, right? I think that information about which part of the brain embryonically develops into which parts in the adult is it may be valuable context for you, but I'm not going to test you on that specifically. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions about this. I'll see you in a future video.